The sky above Earth burned. Flashes of plasma fire lit the heavens like dying stars, streaks of energy cutting through the night. The once proud human cities were reduced to smoking husks, their towering structures shattered, their streets filled with nothing but rubble and ghosts. And yet, the humans still fought. General Karvas of the Zelvari Empire stood aboard his flagship, staring down at the war-torn surface below. His golden eyes narrowed, his mandibles clicking in irritation. The war was over. Or at least it should have been. The humans were out of resources. Their fleets had been torn apart, their colonies abandoned or glassed. And yet, they refused to surrender. Why won't they just give up? One of his officers muttered beside him. Karvas didn't respond immediately. Instead, his gaze flicked to the holographic war table, where the battle below played out in cold, calculated detail. The last remnants of Earth's military forces were pinned inside what had once been one of their largest underground bunkers. No reinforcements were coming. No supply lines remained intact. The humans were starving, cut off, completely surrounded. And yet, they kept fighting. They are irrational, another officer sneered. They should have surrendered days ago. Holding this position is pointless. Karvas tapped a claw against the table. The humans' defenses were crumbling. They had lost nearly everything. And yet, something is wrong, he murmured. The room fell silent. The Zelvari had conquered dozens of worlds, shattered civilizations, crushed countless armies. But none of them had fought like this. Commander, another officer prompted hesitantly. Karvas exhaled sharply. They're not just being stubborn. His voice was quiet, calculating. He watched as another wave of Zelvari troops stormed the bunker entrance and were cut down. A futile defense. They were delaying the inevitable. But why? Karvas' claws tapped against the war table. The humans had already lost. So what were they waiting for? His mandibles clicked together in thought. He had spent years studying humanity, learning their strengths, their weaknesses, their fragile psychology. Humans broke when faced with overwhelming force. They should have broken by now. But they hadn't. And that could only mean one thing. Karvas' eyes narrowed. We're missing something. His voice was barely above a whisper. But in his gut, for the first time in the war, he felt uneasy. The underground bunker shook as another explosion rocked the surface above. Dust and debris rained down from the cracked ceiling, coating the already ruined walls in a fine layer of white powder. Inside, the last of Earth's defenders stood battered, wounded, but still armed. The humans were pinned down, trapped in a final stand. Outgunned, outnumbered, no reinforcements coming. And yet, they held the line. Outside, the Zelvari Empire's war machine was preparing for its final push. Inside his command outpost, General Karvas watched the incoming data stream from his forces. The bunker doors are failing, an officer reported, his mandibles twitching. One last breach, and they'll be exposed. Karvas gave a slow nod. Victory was imminent. And yet, something still nagged at him. Send a final transmission, he ordered. Tell them to surrender. Offer them life in exchange for compliance. A Zelvari officer opened the comms link, broadcasting directly into the human holdout. Humans, you have lost. The voice echoed through the half-destroyed bunker, coming through flickering speakers and damaged comm units. Your resistance is meaningless. Your planet is ours. Your armies are shattered. Your people will not come for you. The Zelvari troops listened closely, expecting the humans to finally break, to plead for mercy, to drop their weapons. But instead, laughter. A hoarse, exhausted laugh came through the comms. Inside the bunker, one of the human soldiers, still bleeding from a plasma wound, leaned against the wall and grinned. You don't get it, do you? Karvas' expression darkened. Explain, he demanded. The human tilted his head, smirking. You think surrender is an option for us? Another explosion shook the ground. The Zelvari war machines were at the final door now. You think we fight because we hope to win today? The human continued, his voice mocking, almost amused. He slowly pushed himself up, ignoring his wounds, ignoring the odds stacked against them. You don't understand humans at all, do you? Karvas' mandibles tensed. You're delaying the inevitable, the Zelvari general growled. The human's grin widened. No, he whispered. Then, his eyes flickered to the bunker clock on the wall. And Karvas realized too late that the humans weren't trying to win. They were waiting. The Zelvari war machines pressed forward, their towering mechanical frames crushing rubble beneath their weight. Plasma cannons hummed, their barrels glowing white-hot, primed to end the last human resistance. Inside the bunker, alarms blared. The reinforced doors were beginning to give way. The last remaining soldiers stood ready, silent, focused. And at the center of them, the grinning human prisoner watched it all unfold with amusement. "You still think you're winning, don't you?" he murmured. Outside, General Carvas clenched his claws, watching the advancing forces on his holoscreen. "Enough of this," he growled. He turned to his officers. "Advance all units. Wipe them out." The Zelvari forces surged forward, a wall of alien warriors, overwhelming in numbers and firepower. The bunker doors finally collapsed. Smoke and dust billowed into the air. And yet, the humans didn't panic. They didn't retreat. They didn't even flinch. The first wave of Zelvari troops stormed in. And then, they stopped. "Commander," one of the alien officers muttered, his voice hollow, shaken. Carvas narrowed his eyes. "What is it?" The officer pointed at the bodies. Or rather, the lack of them. Carvas froze. There should have been hundreds of human corpses in that bunker. They had been fighting for days. The Zelvari had overwhelmed them, cut off their supply lines, crushed their defenses. So where were the dead? A cold sensation crawled up Carvas' spine. Where are their bodies? The advancing Zelvari began hesitating. They moved deeper into the bunker, checking every corner, every shadow. But there were no fallen humans. No discarded weapons. No signs of retreat. It was wrong. It was impossible. And then, a flicker on the motion scanners. A new signal. "Commander," another officer whispered, his voice barely holding steady. I think we walked into something." Carvas' claws dug into the war table, realization crashing over him like ice. The humans weren't losing. They were repositioning. They had never been trapped. The Zelvari had walked straight into a kill box. And now, it was too late to turn back. The Zelvari forces had marched forward with confidence. They had stormed into the bunker, believing themselves to be the executioners of the last human resistance. They had seen the humans bleeding, starving, outnumbered. And yet, the bodies were missing. The faint beeping of motion scanners filled the silence, growing louder, sharper. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. On the Zelvari flagship, General Carvas' claws curled into a fist as he stared at the sudden movement spikes on his war table. The battlefield was changing. The human soldiers hadn't died. They had disappeared. They had repositioned. And now, the kill box had snapped shut. A transmission crackled through the open comms channel, but it wasn't from his soldiers. It was from the human prisoner. The same grinning fool who had been captured earlier, still sitting in his restraints, still bleeding but smiling. "You still don't get it, do you?" Carvas' mandibles twitched in frustration. "What is this? What have you done?" he snarled. The human exhaled, shaking his head with mock disappointment. "You thought we were losing." A chilling pause. "But we were just waiting for you to step inside the fire." The Zelvari officers paled. On the war table, hundreds of new signals appeared. Not from Zelvari forces. From humans. They had been underground the entire time. They had let the Zelvari march forward. They had let them believe they were winning. And now, the trap had closed. Inside the bunker, the Zelvari troops heard the sound first. The click of weapons arming. The low hum of hidden artillery warming up. The shuffle of movement from every darkened corridor. Then, the first explosion. Then another. Then another. Plasma fire erupted from the walls, from hidden defense turrets, from snipers perched in the ruins above. The Zelvari had walked into a human ambush. And they were already dead. Carvas' throat went dry. "How? You think humans fight alone?" The human prisoner interrupted, his voice dripping with amusement. He leaned forward slightly, his restraints creaking against the force of his grin. "You thought we were losing?" A distant, deafening explosion ripped through the war table's visuals. Human reinforcements, far larger than estimated, burst from the underground tunnels, cutting off every retreat path. The Zelvari were surrounded. Carvas felt it now. The same fear his soldiers must have felt inside that bunker. The same terror creeping into his chest. And the human? He just smiled. "You were never winning." The line went dead, and the human counterattack began. The Zelvari forces had walked willingly into the abyss. And now, the abyss had closed around them. The bunker had been a lie, not a place of last resistance, not a desperate holdout. A kill box. A perfect trap. Inside the ruined structure, plasma fire erupted from every direction. Snipers hidden in the shadows picked off Zelvari officers before they could give orders. Auto turrets, long buried beneath rubble, sprang to life, cutting down entire squads. Grenades, mines, explosives, all primed, all waiting. And the worst part? The humans were not fighting like soldiers. They were fighting like predators. Silent, precise, unstoppable. On the Zelvari flagship, General Karvas stood frozen, staring at the chaos unfolding on the war table. His army was breaking. What had been a victorious march into the final battle was now a massacre. His forces were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, overwhelmed, and for the first time in his life, he knew what it meant to be prey. Inside the bunker, Zelvari warriors, once confident, now scrambled for cover. "Where's the exit?" one of them screeched. "There is no exit," another yelled, realizing too late that every escape route was sealed. And then, the humans emerged. They had waited for this moment, for the Zelvari to walk right where they needed them, for the Zelvari to understand what true terror felt like. The first human soldier appeared in the smoke, rifle raised. Then another. Then hundreds. "No," one of the Zelvari whispered, his voice cracking with pure, primal horror. They should have surrendered," another stammered. "But humans don't surrender. They endure." And now, they were done running. The order to retreat came too late. The first wave of Zelvari fell instantly. The second wave tried to fight, but were crushed beneath the weight of the human counteroffensive. The third wave? They didn't even try to shoot. They just ran. And humanity cut them down all the same. On the flagship, Karvas watched his officers break down in panic. "General, we have to pull back. No escape routes available. We're losing entire battalions." Karvas slammed his claws on the war table. "How?" he roared. "How are we losing?" And then, the human prisoner, still restrained in his chair, laughed. A slow, deliberate, satisfied laugh. "I told you," he said softly. Blood dripped down his face. His uniform was burned, torn, but his eyes burned with something else. Something terrifying. You were never winning. And for the first time in his life, General Karvas believed him. The Zelvari Empire had never lost a war. Until now. The once proud alien armada, which had darkened Earth's skies with its warships, now lay in ruins. Smoke and wreckage filled the battlefield. The bodies of Zelvari warriors, once convinced of their own superiority, now littered the ground, slain by the very species they had called weak. The humans stood victorious, not because of superior weapons, not because of overwhelming numbers, but because they refused to lose. On the Zelvari flagship, General Karvas sat in silence. His claws trembled. His mind raced. He had never known fear like this. He had never believed that humans, fragile, disorganized, chaotic humans, could have turned the tide of a war this decisive. And yet, they had. Not by fighting harder, not by having stronger technology, but by enduring, by tricking him into believing they were already beaten, by making him walk straight into their trap. A single Zelvari officer limped forward, blood dripping from his wounds. "General," he rasped. We have to retreat." Karvas couldn't respond, because he knew there was nowhere left to retreat to. His fleet was crippled. His army was shattered. And the humans? They weren't done yet. The human prisoner, still in restraints, still grinning despite his wounds, let out a slow, ragged breath. "We don't surrender." His voice was quiet, almost pitying. "Because we don't fight alone." Karvas' throat went dry. The war was over, and humanity had won. Not because they were the strongest, not because they were the fastest, but because they refused to break, because they refused to die. And now, the entire galaxy would never forget it.